Koka Sunarai Sunarayanti. 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 Koka Sunarai Sunarayanti.
To this new episode of the Mango TV podcast. Today I'm very excited to have Alnoor Ladha. Alnoor's work focuses on the intersection of political organizing, system thinking, structural change, inner-outer mirroring, but I'm particularly interested in that, and narrative work. Alnoor comes from a Sufi lineage and writes about the crossroads of politics and spirituality in troubled times. So you might have a lot to say these days. His work has been published in Al Jazeera, The Guardian, Truthout, Fast Company, Cosmos Journal, New Internationalist, and the Huffington Post, among others. He's a board member of Culture Hack Labs, a cooperatively run advisory for social movement. He's currently the co-director of the Transition Resource Circle and co-author of Post Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in the Time of Collapse. He's also a co-founder and steward of Tierra Valiente, a post-capitalist experiment in the northern jungle of Costa Rica. Welcome, Alnor.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you, Giancarlo.
Yes, Alnor is a friend from old time. We did a Burning Man together in, I don't know, 2010 maybe.
Yeah, and then again in 2018 as well, we ended up being in the same place.
In the same camp, yes. So tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of the biographical data. Where did you grow up and when did you decide to devote your life in helping others? If there was any cathartic moment.
Yeah, yeah. So I grew up in a Sufi tradition. So I grew up in a family where spirituality and meditation was kind of central to the worldview. Um, and they were also immigrants. My parents are from East Africa. My mom's family's from Zanzibar. My dad from Uganda. Uh, they had very different migratory paths to Canada.
Sorry to interrupt you already, but the Sufi tradition is from Iran.
Sufism is the mystical impulse of Islam, and there's many types of tariqas. They call them sort of communities. So our kind of lineage traces itself back to uh, Fatima, which is Muhammad's daughter. So we were called the Fatimids.
From your mother?
Both sides actually. Both sides actually.
Oh wow.
So they're diaspora. So they left Arabia and went to Egypt. They were the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt from 800 to 1200 AD. And then when the Crusades happened and the Seljuks sacked Cairo, they migrate to Persia. So they were in Persia for like 700 years. And there's 72 different sects of Islam within Shia. So they're just within the traditional sects. Then within Sufism, there's dozens of various Sufi tariqas. And so my tribe were called the Fatimids. In Persia, we became what was known as the Hashasin, working with hashish and Syrian rue, and they abandoned nonviolent Sufism and went to war with the Sunni Shah, and then they became the Ismailis. And so it's a it's a Shia branch. And in my family, my uncle, my mom's brother, had a huge influence on me, especially at a young age. He was a Sufi scholar, Islamic scholar, and historian at McGill in Montreal. And he basically denounced Ismailism because he felt like it became too institutional. And he went back to what he would call like almost a pre-Islamic Sufism, where
Wow.
there's it's almost like desert animism, the kind of the original impulse of the Arabian Peninsula. And he was very influenced by um, different types of Sufi traditions, and he spent a lot of time researching the Sufis of Hunza, who are also from a Ismaili impulse, but various Persian tariqas of Sufism, various Arabian tariqas of Sufism, and sort of merge them. And so, just to give you a sense of the school of thought, one of his first teachings to us when we were young is Allah God is a metaphor for the universe becoming self-aware.
Mm.
And it's becoming self-aware not just through you in an anthropocentric way, but through all of consciousness. And so, in this sense, it is a kind of, philosophers would call it like monist idealism or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Bernardo Kastrup would call it metaphysical idealism, right? Are you familiar with Bernardo Kastrup?
I love Bernardo Kastrup's work. Yeah, he would call it analytical idealism or something
Yeah,
like that. Yeah.
which is cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, we are in the mind of God, that
Yeah,
consciousness is the, what he would say is the ontological primitive.
exactly.
It's
Yeah,
the building
exactly.
block
It's yeah,
of
it's
reality.
mind. It's mind before matter, not the other way around.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was the tradition I grew up in. And yet, because my family were immigrants, there was also a strong desire and pull to fit into Canadian society and to be quote unquote successful. And sometimes our tribe is called like the Jews of Islam, because we've
Mm,
been in persecution and exile and diaspora and hiding, and they're also materially quite successful, and so they
mm.
do well in the world, and there's a lot of jealousy directed at them and what have you. And so there was a lot of pressure on us to be doctors and lawyers and CEOs and sort of do well within that existing system. And part of me was always in sort of rejection of that socialization, and part of me went along and played the game. And
What were you against? You felt you didn't belong there?
yeah, there was always a sense that this kind of live, work, consume, die paradigm was empty, and then I would see the people that I was supposed to emulate that became successful lawyers or business people, and I would look at their lives, and it wasn't even like I wasn't even articulate at that point about it. There wasn't even a sense of like cognition around it. It was more this visceral sense of the nuclear family. Just it gave me a sense of deep angst and ennui, and so in some ways that was like a big part of it. The other was like the lack of service to something bigger than oneself.
Yeah,
It felt really small to me,
yeah.
and so in some ways, I had very little ambition
Yeah, but because sorry
materially.
to interrupt, Norma, because in Canada, like in North America, like in the West, the ontology is about material, um, scientific materialism. So this idea that there is no cosmic consciousness with the universe with intelligent design is this idea that this whole cosmos is a gigantic clock, very mechanical. So probably that's the culture you were breathing there.
For sure, and I think it's the culture most of us who are living in the dominant culture of the West,
The
right?
West, yeah,
Whether that's
yeah,
North America or Western Europe,
yeah,
or even the geographical global South, like in Australia or New Zealand or even Japan,
yeah.
um, as opposed to the more like geopolitical South, which
Yeah.
is has sort of different impulses. But this geopolitical North, this kind of Western Occidental sensibility, was infused everywhere, and for sure there was a part of me that was coming from a Sufi tradition that was in rejection with this idea of the world can be reduced to its material parts, and all that matters is how much material acquisition we get. That felt empty,
Yeah.
right? But then also the expressions of it, like what people did for a living, uh, you know, going to work and coming back, in the same cycle every day with very little variability, also felt empty. And then the way the nuclear family was organized also felt very empty, coming from a much more tribal, multi generational, integrated culture. And
Mm.
so, even though there was a lot of pressure, especially from my dad's side, they were immigrants from Uganda, they were exiled in 72 by Idi Amin, and lived in a refugee camp and came to Canada on a UN deal, and they really wanted to make their way and 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 be good functioning members of society. And my mom's side, which had a different trajectory from Zanzibar, uh, kept their kind of mystical roots intact, and they were like, you should question the culture. You don't need to assimilate uh, everything that is happening here if you're not okay with it. And And that sort of critical lens that my mom and her brothers gave me was really part of my opening, which is I don't have to accept the culture hook, line, and sinker.
That was good parenting.
Yeah. And so, I remember this moment very particularly where, I was forced to go ice skating and go to skating lessons. And then, in Canada, there's hockey, right? People love playing their ice hockey. And I was this like skinny little Arab Persian, Indian East African kid who just hated being cold, right? Like all my genetic lines were either desert or tropics. And I came back and my mom said, how do you feel about playing ice hockey? And I'm like, you know, I guess like everyone's doing it. I'm just not very good at it. And she said, well, they're all a bit insane, to be on like thin ice on blades, beating each other up. It's just the Canadians, they lack a deeper culture. So this is all they have. And her saying that to me really just opened something in me where I was like, oh, this thing that feels so inevitable and so universal and so big, which is the dominant culture of the West, does not have to be my culture if I don't choose it to be so. And actually, my mom's tacit permission in her critique of the culture opened something for me.
How old were you at this moment, más o menos?
7 or 8,
Oh wow.
something like that. Yeah. And then the other big thing for me was my mom took a vow to the Sufi order to meditate every morning from 4 to 6 a.m. in darkness and silence. She took that vow when she was 7, so she just recently celebrated her 70th anniversary.
Wow.
And she was a midwife,
And
and
she did it for 70 years. She did this two
she
hours
still
meditation.
she still does it. Yeah, yeah.
Incredible.
And she was a midwife, so she would work these 12-hour shifts, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Come home, make dinner, wake up early, drive to mosque, meditate from 4 to 6, come back, make breakfast, go back to work, um, you know, 5 days a week back in the 80s. And then that moved to 4 days a week. But her sheer dedication to this practice and my growing up in that environment where I saw the sacrifices my mom was making and how much she got from this kind of 2 hours of darkness and silence and meditation in the morning, um, also was such a primary influence on me. So, I would spend my summers when I wasn't in school going to this meditation practice with her from as young as I can remember, maybe 4 or 5. And I was really just going through the motions when you're that young. I was sitting and just trying to be still and silent, and that was kind of the best I could do. And then I was given my mantras. We call them zikrs. And when I was like 6 or 7, and then had a kind of profound spiritual experience at some point, quite young, 7 or 8. Uh, and the two things coming together where I had this kind of almost out of body DMT psychedelic experience just from meditation at a very young age, and then also being given the permission to both critique the culture and not be so identified with this like energy stream that was taking everyone with it, in ambition and the desire to fit in. That combination of those two things were very liberating for me.
Do you mind elaborate a little bit on this mystical experience? How would you describe it?
I would describe it as a dissolution of ego experience. That just being in the silence and being with my mantra in this kind of repetitive, patternistic way uh, opened up a type of consciousness that I actually think when you're younger in some ways is easier because you're less identified with who you are. And I just had this flood of bliss in the body, very very DMT in the sense that, white overlapping chrysanthemums and visual patterns and a sense of uh, joy and bliss in the body that I can only really explain as most likely some kind of DMT release. And it was very hard for them to get me out of the trance.
Endogenous DMT release.
Yeah, like an endogenous DMT release, and it was very hard for them to get me out of the trance. I remember, the local imam basically who ran that mosque came and had to shake me out of it.
Wow.
They were almost kind of worried about me, thought I was having an epileptic attack or something like that. And so I would say like this kind of experience of growing up in the center of the empire, in the dominant global north, and also coming from a tradition that has mystical roots and still had this kind of intact culture and this oral tradition and these practices of mantra, of silence, of embodied practices that rooted back thousands of years and connected me to both my ancestral lineage, but also something transcendental, something beyond me. Really helped to shape my decisions not to go and chase money and be in the world of business and all of that.
Yeah, amazing.
I did have my kind of stint in that world for a couple of years, because that's kind of what you do in some ways.
Yeah, no, amazing. You had an ego that 40 years before it was fashionable. But so what happened with high school and and university?
I was not a very ambitious kid. I was not very good at school in the traditional sense. I was probably like neurodivergent in some ways, not necessarily on the spectrum, but getting up in the morning was like anathema to me. The sitting and sort of learning in the way that schools are designed made no sense to me. I just felt like rote memorization, especially when I would be able to come home and read, you know, Sufi mystic poetry and philosophy. What I would then go and read in school just felt so banal and uninspiring. And so I never really engaged that much. I was not a very good student. Would engage in substances. I would, smoke a lot of weed and drink alcohol. And most of my friends dropped out of high school. So I had this whole group of friends who, I was kind of the only one or one of a few who stayed. I was the only one of my friends who actually went to university out of a group of 30 or so boys, mostly immigrants from different cultures in this kind of melting pot of Vancouver. And I was studying philosophy and Russian literature, inspired by my uncle on the philosophy side, and probably some weird past life proclivity around on Russian lit, and then started reading through Russian lit about 1917 and the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then got really interested in political thought, and actually early on became a Marxist. Some would argue maybe a Trotskyite, and I was really interested in this idea of like less communism as a state structure and more like communalism. And then as my thinking developed in my kind of mid 20s and I started doing more political organizing work, I realized I was not a Marxist at all, that I didn't really believe in the state solution, that I was actually more of an anarchist. And I believed in localization and bioregionalism, and then really spent the last 15 plus years researching and writing and thinking about this intersection between anarchism and mysticism and how they're the same impulse, really.
Okay, I'd love to dive into anarchism and mysticism. Sounds fascinating. But just last question about, personal development and growth. And so, your sense of, self-realization and self-authoring, that was already clear from this, young age mystical experience and this freedom that your mother gave you to, not to identify with a specific culture. So at that point, you were free from your cultural conditioning because you didn't have any.
No, I would say like I'd say you're never free from your cultural conditioning, right? I would say that maybe there's these moments of transcension of subject to object and complete dissolution that are momentary, but I kind of am a McKennaite in the sense where I think the role of these boundary dissolving, ego dissolving experiences is to step outside of the culture to realize that there's aspects of the culture that are just collectively agreed upon delusions, and then you come back into the culture in order to change the culture. And I feel like I had a very strong culture in the sense that I come from this Sufi tradition, and that it's a very intact, strong tradition with elders and ritual and ceremony and practice. And so what the point though of cultures that are, let's say, worthy of the word culture, mystical traditions, indigenous traditions, etc., is that they hold you in your ability to have these experiences, and they contextualize you in the moment we're in. And then the dominant culture, which is what I was calling this comes from the work of Hakim Bey, where he calls it the work, consume, die paradigm. The materialist paradigm, where there is no other meaning, um, and in its sense is very nihilistic in its materialism. There's a meaninglessness in it. Um, that culture, I've always danced with it, knowing that no matter how free we think we are, we have always are internalizing aspects of it. And there's a constant practice of deconditioning and decolonization that the spiritual practices help with, but can never fully cure you of, right? Because the hardwiring is within us, right? The idea that we are separate selves, the idea that there is a you, Giancarlo, and a me, Alnoor, and that and in some ways there is a material aspect, and of course non-dualistically it's true, right? We have to put food on the table and pay our bills and all of that. And so what a non-dualistic approach like Sufism or Taoism, what they really helped me do was just to be able to navigate rather than transcend. And I think a lot of new age philosophy, where I have issue with it, is it's trying to transcend uh, the structures of the material world rather than to be able to navigate this non-dual and dualistic simultaneous experience of being in the world and also not fully and solely of the world.
I understand. So basically, your Sufi practice was really was that was the anchor for some sort of mental stability and mental wellness. You never had moment of being lost or anxiety and.
No, of course, and I still do,
Mhm.
and I think the world is a very destabilizing place. And I think any
It's,
right,
it's confusing. It's confusing for sure.
and especially right now, right? We're on this kind of accelerating, like quickening that just feels more and more intense, right? And I think any tidy, neat narrative of this is the way the world is and the way the world should be, and now I have this model, I can therefore make sense of the whole world. I think that always breaks down at some point, and has to, in order sometimes even just for your worldview and your faith to be tested at the very least. But most likely because it's never a full and accurate picture, because I don't believe such thing exists. I don't believe there's one meta narrative that will remove all angst and anxiety and discomfort and neuroses.
But maybe can alleviate them.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I think there can be a practice and a learnedness, and that's what the aim of spiritual practice is.
Yeah.
And this is how masters achieve certain levels of achievement.
But so tell us a little bit about how did your exploration started and how it's developing, and most importantly, how it's been applied. This intersection about anarchism and mysticism.
Yeah,
Maybe for our audience that might be a little bit less familiar with these terms, maybe you can just remind real quick
yeah,
what is for you anarchism and mysticism, and how this exploration then was applied to the several community you wrote about and also physically implemented.
yeah. So mysticism is the type of spirituality that is based on disintermediation. So there's no mediation, direct experience. In the Greek tradition, they would call it gnosis,
Yeah.
right? And even all the major religious traditions have their version of mysticism, right? Judaism has Kabbalah, Islam has Sufism, Christianity has Gnosticism. There's esoteric Buddhism. Taoism is inherently a mystical tradition. Most indigenous traditions are, and earth-based traditions are direct wisdom traditions where you're in relationship to the living world. And so it's not always kind of transcendental God out there. It is sometimes and often the immanent here. Um, and so mysticism is about this direct Gnostic experience, this direct relationality to a power source, universal consciousness, Allah, God, whatever you want to call it, that is bigger than the individual ego and soul and storyline. And then anarchism is not anarchy. This conflation is often created on purpose, in order to discredit anarchism. Right? Anarchism is a very sophisticated political philosophy that's 200 plus years old, that initially came out of Russia, and then other parts of Europe, through people like Kropotkin in Russia and Proudhon in France, um, and it has a very rich tradition. and in many ways was vying against Marxist communism as the kind of central theory of the left, and then lost. And basically, the communists did very specifically, especially in the Second International, made a strong effort because they understood the emancipatory potential of anarchism and were also scared of it and believed it couldn't happen. And at a very simple level, what anarchism is about is um, individual and community decisions about how we want to live our lives. And one of the central tenets of anarchism is this idea of subsidiarity. And very simply, what it means is the people most affected by the decision should be the people making the decision, right? It's so common sense. Anarchism in modern times is localism and bioregionalism. People connected by watersheds and mountains and where forests begin and end, making decisions. So we have, for example, like the Cascadia movement that's happening in the US and Canada and Turtle Island, the Zapatistas in Mexico and Chiapas. You have the Kurdish autonomous zone of Rojava, this 5 million person community in the Middle East, and lots of small experiments in between.
These three community you mentioned, how big are they? Because it seems that this is something that can work on a small scale, right?
Well, Cascadia would be several million people in a kind of bioregional autonomous area. I don't think the U.S. is going to concede that, but it's interesting to observe the movement and also the kind of cultural aspects of it. The Zapatistas are probably 1.5 million person community. They run Chiapas, the breadbasket of Mexico. They declared independence from Mexico in '94. Mexican government, with the help of the CIA, went to war against them and lost. And so they've been in this struggle for almost 30 years now, and run their own economy, their own currency, their own roads, their own education system. They grow their own food. And Rojava is a 5 million person community. It's the kind of the largest of these kind of anarchist, what I call maybe post capitalist experiments.
But so, how does the governance work? How do you organize 5 million people? There must be some sort of leadership and
No, of course,
representation.
of course. I think this is also like a common misnomer, that the idea that anarchism means no law. What it really means is direct democracy. So there's people deciding at local levels. Those local councils then ladder up to a kind of regional council, and those regional council then ladders up to a kind of autonomous zone wide council. So it's basically uh, you know, electoral democracy, the idea that you vote every 4 years and put someone in power to make decisions who are completely, disconnected, is even in the U.S. was the kind of framers of the Constitution. Their belief was this would be a temporary structure, and it has become this permanent structure. And so it's not a sustainable model. And we see what happens with electoral democracy, right? Money hijacks the political process. Like capitalism and democracy are in conflict, right? Capitalism tells you $1, one vote, and democracy tells you one person, one vote. And capitalism always, that dollar always will defeat the democratic process. And what anarchism and localism are about is direct democracy through relationship. So you have a relationship with your local council. Through that local council, a person is elected and selected, who's then brings the issues to a broader regional area of concern. That then decisions get made at like a kind of supra level decision making. But anyways, I think
But
we
so,
get.
how is this system protected and from money, from candidate with more resources that can influence more votes?
Because it's one person, one vote. There's no lobbying machinery involved in it, and there's deep relationships at a community level
Because it's local, it's smaller, yeah.
because it's local. It happens at a smaller scale, and then it ladders up and replicates. And so there's a deep care and concern at its core, as opposed to the kind of media spectacle democracy that we have now in the West. Where it's buying billboards and advertising, right? The impulse of anarchism. One of its famous taglines was "No gods, no masters." And mysticism is very similar. No popes, no imams, no Qurans, no Bibles, direct experience. That these two kind of overlap in impulse. because they're really about direct relationship with something bigger than us, and at its core, being in service, right? And so you and I had this discussion right before we started about, is it self first? Do we take care of ourselves and then contribute to the other, or the other way around? And I actually think that this is an old dichotomy that is actually discursive, right? That they feed each other. And so for me, what happened in my early 20s was my political organizing work really activated my spiritual experience. I would go to these protests, for example. Seattle 99 was a big influence on me. I was 19 years old, tens of thousands of people in the streets protesting the World Trade Organization, kind of the birth of the anti-globalization movement. And it sort of felt like almost festival culture. All these other people who care about this huge thing and are willing to sacrifice their lives and go to jail and read books and be involved in ideas and understand political theory. And I kind of had found my tribe in some ways. And what would happen when we were doing a protest against Monsanto or Coca-Cola or, yeah, the World Bank or what have you, was that I would get to these almost like transcendental peak experiences, and it would also test my ideology. You know, how much is this the other, right? And how much is this the world I want to create? And what it did was, you'd have these deep levels of disappointment as well, because power will continue to do what it wants to do. So you'd spend weeks on trying to, for example, Monsanto was doing these massive land grabs in Kenya, and we were working with some of the indigenous communities in Kenya to stop these land grabs, and we lost campaign after campaign. And what this did for me was put me into this deep tumult and this deep internal inquiry of what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I would find that the spiritual practice got supercharged, if you will. I would go and I would do Vipassana. I would go and I would have a mushroom experience. And my whole lens was like, how do I be in deeper service? And this is what sort of drove my spiritual practice, but it's also what drove my political practice. It's what drove me to be in deeper solidarity with people who were being and are being marginalized by the dominant culture. And that there's a responsibility for someone like me who comes from a place of privilege and the education of the West and access to the things we have access to, yoga and tantra and Ayurveda and ayahuasca and festival culture and all of this, is like, my aim is not to go there and find some individual transcendence, but is to deepen my practice and to try to create a world where these things are accessible to everyone.
Yes. Um, what a counter argument of this, synergy, if you want, between the personal work and the societal work. People would say that, unless your shadows and your pain bodies and your demons are somewhat resolved, they might interfere with the intentionality and also the nature of the action, and might taint the activism with ego.
Oh, for sure. That risk, that risk always exists, I would say. And I don't think it's necessarily a counter, but it's more of a, this is the edge we have to walk. Like, here's the risk on the other side. If we believe that we have to achieve some high levels of internal self-realization before we are in service to the world, we will create a culture of spiritual narcissism. And this work is never ending. And people will be in this never-ending shadow process, and never-ending ceremonies, and going to ayahuasca weekends, and they're like, oh, we're getting ready to do something, right? And it never happens. And then on the other side, you're right. What happens is, and I've of course seen this a lot on the left, is like, there's these people who want to change the world, but they have not even started their inner development work, and they end up replicating a lot of the traumas and project it out into the world, and it makes activism not interesting anymore, right? And it makes it not appealing, and it reinforces identity politics and us versus them, and I think activism has got a bad rap, partly because it has been led for so many years by a very strong materialist rationalist culture, right? And so this is why I think that the kind of traditional self-development, self-realization, human potential movement of the 60s and 70s, which kind of fell on its own weight in some ways. The kind of bankruptcy of that movement led all these, radicals and hippies of the 60s into then just becoming like the next power elites of Silicon Valley, right? Because they didn't have a deep rooting in service. They didn't have a deep critique of the dominant culture and the political economy of capitalism. And on their watch, this kind of supercharged techno-fascist neoliberalism got created. Now, on the other side, traditional activism is also dying, right? Because the kind of materialist lens just got reinforced, and the belief was that if we just take over the organs of power, somehow there's going to be this revolution. But what happens is you end up replicating those same structures, right? Because there's that same level of consciousness is producing it. And I think what we're seeing now is this synthesis happening where there's a beginning to be an understanding that we have to do the deep internal work, and simultaneously we need to apply that work into the world with the lens of service. And then through that work, there's this discursive, reflexive feedback loop, the world we want to create, right? Like if we're going into an ayahuasca ceremony with the intention of, please give me counsel and direction on our collective healing and collective co-liberation, I think the plants are going to be much more responsive than us going into ceremony being like, help me manifest that new job or that new car or whatever, this personal security. That these are such low ambitions for these deities, these gods, these plants that, have an agenda for us and want to see human evolution happen.
This is so interesting. So I know you have to go soon, but let's go back to you know y- how did this exploration, this how this is the integration of anarchism and mysticism then look like? I know you've been consultant or even you've been part of many community building. How does it look practically, the mysticism, what to believe and who to pray to, and the practice that it's very experiential and is personal to every individual, or there is some sort of temple center where people would then get together and share this moment of mysticism, or not? And then how this mystical practice then interact with the anarchic framework. In an anarchist society, everybody's encouraged to participate politically. So practically, how does it work on the ground? How is how's a typical day of an anarchic mystic person in a community like that?
That's a really good question. Part of the kind of both, I would say, the anarchist impulse and the mystical impulse is truth is a pathless land. That there is no one way to do. You can't be an anarchist or a mystic and try to hold dogma of there is a particular way to do it, right? And so what we say is that there's these kind of three orienting inquiries, let's say, and we call it polis, eros, and gnosis. And so for us,
Polis, eros, and gnosis.
yeah.
Interesting.
So polis is rethinking the political economy.
Yeah.
So the type of content we have at our gatherings, uh, the type of just facilitators we bring in, uh, often have this lens, and even the way we organize as a community. So we say we don't believe in private property. Uh, One person should not benefit from the labor of everyone else. There should be no speculation on land. And so we bought the land and we put it into a trust. Nobody owns it. We run it as a not for profit cooperative. Um, of the surplus, there's a small pool allocated to profit sharing, no distinction between labor and capital. So it doesn't matter if you put in the initial money that is now a gift, or you're a full time Costa Rican working on the farm or the kitchen or what have you, you get equal profit sharing, and that there's a direct democracy model in terms of decision making. And so that the kind of political aspect then is really embedded into the core of it. And no one's going to sign up to that unless you've done some kind of political work and you have a bend towards this type of more democratic, decentralized approaches. That also requires more time, than just living in an apartment in Brooklyn or what have you, and paying your monthly condo fee. There's interaction that's required. There's discourse that's required. The second part of Gnosis is we also organize around deep spiritual experiences together as a community. So, for example, on Sunday, I go into silent dieta for 2 weeks. We have a Shipibo teacher coming from that tradition in Peru, where for 2 weeks the whole community goes into silence and no eye contact and one meal a day, and works with one of the various Shipibo plants, which are mostly non-psychoactive plants, these kind of healing plants in the Dieta Shipibo canon.
And the vegetalismo, yeah.
Yeah, the kind of vegetalismo culture. But we also will have a Vipassana maybe once a year. We have Tantra teachers coming. We have various Buddhist teachers, Taoist teachers, Sufi teachers come. And we bring kind of all the streams together for people to decide what they think is interesting. And we also speak about it. So, like, we have a Polis council where we discuss the latest, most interesting stuff that's happening in the political world. We also have this Gnosis council where people who go out in the world and have their experiences, whether they go to an ashram in India or do a longer dieta in Peru or do an online course or whatever, come back and share with the community what they're learning and what they're practicing. And that's part of the discussion and the fabric of the culture. And then the last part is the eros, which is we're not an open love community like Tamara or whatever, but we believe that your relationship is not your private affair, that it affects the field, and that we openly have discussion about our relationships. There's people who practice polyamory, there's people who practice monogamy, there's people who practice celibacy, and we just have open discussions on why we're in this particular spiritual erotic practice right now. And there's no kind of right or wrong to it. And we also think of eros as the deeper relationship with the living world and with animism. And so there's this kind of erotic kinship and relationality with the forest we live in, with the water, with the air, with the elements, with the food, that we also want to be in contemplation and in service to.
These kind of meetings and gathering, that's what you're referring to when you're talking about from your bio, inner and outer mirroring.
It's part of it, yeah. It's like, look, the community experiment is one reflection of that, and of course, there's only 20 or so people. We're all friends. We've known each other for a long time. That practice is easier. But some of this work of the inner outer work is sometimes when we're working with activist groups, sometimes when we're working with funders, sometimes with the social movements. That part of what we are in practice of and what we're learning is that the external world is mirroring our internal world, and our internal world is mirroring our external world. Like, there's this kind of old Buddhist line that says enlightenment doesn't happen in the cave, it happens in the mouth of the lion. Right? That, like, enlightenment is not just about the individual going out and finding self-enlightenment, but it's when it's messy, and when you're out in the world and being strangled by the context of capitalism and neoliberalism, and a genocide in Israel and Palestine happening, and crises around the world, and peak oil and peak patriarchy and peak white supremacy and peak stupidity, and potentially also peak possibility, right? All of it is happening at the same time, and so the grappling with what's happening in the external world is influencing our internal state. Of course, we're not separate. There is no such thing in a very real way as the separate individual, right? We are a congress of beings, from the bacteria that live in our body to our ancestors speaking through us epigenetically and vibratorily, to our relationality and kinship with the ecosystem, the ecology, with all the people we interact with. And so this kind of inner outer mirroring is happening all the time. It doesn't mean that simply we get our inner state in order and then the external world is going to shift and collapse into some superposition, right, of our desire, right? But it's also not that simply because the external world might even be in a moment of calm that our internal world reflects that we have to actively uh, be in dynamic response and relationality and responsibility with what's happening both internally and externally. And there's no goal. There's no goal to say, I'm in this great internal state, I'm going to impose this on the external world. And there's no thing of like the external world is in such a place of disrepair that I'm just going to find my solitude internally. part of the work is to be heartbroken by what's happening, to hold both the grief and the gratitude as two hands of the prayer of what's happening in this current moment, and to be in this constant practice of awareness and recalibration and contribution through prayer and practice.
Yeah, this is very interesting. But so, did you mention that you guys are only 20 people?
Yeah, there's about 20 people who live here, and then there's gatherings that happen, often weekly, where 20 to 30 new people come. There's about 20 to 30 coworkers on the land. So at any given point, there's 60 people in the mix.
But that was a choice. You guys didn't want to grow. You think that's a right number?
Yeah, I think for us, at least right now, it works. We're in the midst of building more housing, a small kind of residential cohort of tiny homes, and maybe we'll get to 40, but we probably don't want to be much bigger than that. Maybe 40 adults and 10 kids or something like that.
And for the kids, what is the education? They're all like community schooled.
Yeah, there's a mix. There's definitely a lot of free range kids around who are not in the kind of box structure of a school, and then there's parents who want to put their kids in the local school here. And my brother and his partners, their two daughters, go to the local high school because they got to an age at 12 and 11 that they're kind of a small community is not enough stimulus for them anymore.
Of course, of
Whereas
course.
some of the younger kids like don't want to be out there right now and really enjoy having a kind of small community homeschool setup.
This is so interesting. So, Alnor, I know you have to go. Let me ask you just a couple of if people want to research the three anarchic community you mentioned, the Rajava, the Zapatista, and the one in British Columbia. We'll put it on the show notes. Would you recommend any books or the documentary for people that want to know more about those experiments? Those It's not our experiment. They've been on for a while and they're big enough. Yeah.
Yeah, I can send you some links that we can post on the show notes.
Okay, great. And personally, how are you feeling these days? You're in a good space. You said you went traveling and now you're back home.
Yeah, I think I'm in this a place that many people are in, which is kind of um, a sense of disbelief that we're still at this state, that and really internalizing the impunity of empire, right? That
Yeah.
the U.S. and Israel can continue an almost 3 month, uh, you know, uh, totally incommensurate, asymmetric, violent. Um, extremist state policy of ethnic cleansing, and at least we can argue an attempted genocide, uh, and the fact that there's even debate about that, is so insane. And the fact that there's cancellation if and this kind of weaponization of the idea of anti-Semitism is so insane, that we can't be critical of a state's policy or that makes us racist somehow, right? Like the culture is degraded to such a place where the discourse is at such a low level. And what we're willing to accept is, the level of kind of violence and warfare and inhumanity and degradation of life that we're willing to accept is so extreme that I think many of us are living in this grief of like, where do we even go from here? How does one move on? And that conjunction with the ecological crises and mass species extinction and the kind of ongoing rolling of like fossil fuel exploration and far right governments being elected and fascist autocracy on the rise, like we are in a moment of like, what do we collectively do? And I think we're all in that anyone who's like, I'm feeling amazing right now, and in the kind of tech utopian, crypto will save us or AI will save us, I think those people are insane. That we have to really take stock at this moment and realize that at least the dominant culture, where it is leading so-called civilization, is into a very dark place. And this is a time to really deepen our practice, deepen our spiritual and our political practice, deepen our lines of solidarity, and really get straight with what's happening and what's ours to do, and how we be in deepest service to the living world and the unfolding of consciousness. And that's really, for me, the only inquiry right now.
Yeah. But so, what advice do you have for the young generation that might be out of college or maybe just out of high school and they want to help? They want to be an activist, be politically engaged. What advice do you have for them? Where do they look? Who should they join? Where should they go?
I'd say starting with being a good student of our culture. If we spent a third of the time we do on self-help stuff that we would on understanding the political economy, we would already have a revolution on our hands. And so to really be a good student of the culture, to really understand the impoverishment of the Western way of life and its imposition on the rest of the world. I think if Westerners internalize that, in some ways, that is the most important. We would do less harm, at least. We wouldn't be imposing our way of living and trying to get financial inclusion and so-called development in the geopolitical South, and really trying to export the McDonald's culture all around the world. So I think trying to be really a good student of our culture, and then also the second thing I'd say is to disassociate from the culture. For me, this was such a huge part of my spiritual political awakening, is to realize that just because you're part of the culture, it doesn't mean that you ratify,
You have to accept it. Yeah.
right, every aspect of the culture. And the more critical we are of the culture, the more interesting alternatives will emerge. Um, and then I would say maybe the third part is this spiritual political praxis, that there is no outside and there is no inside in a very real sense, that we have to deepen our internal work, the meditation, the mantra, the silence, the dancing, the tantra, the psychedelic exploration, of course, done with responsibility, with intact cultures that know how to hold, especially the psychedelic medicines, and to find the elders, who can navigate these terrains, but then also just start to create embodied cultures themselves. We can do this, to create embodied post-capitalist culture does not require millions of people. We could do that with 3 people. We could find 2 other people and be in discussion about our disdain for the culture, what values we want to live by, start practices of, gifting circles, of sharing, and bring in values like generosity and altruism and solidarity with life and interbeing and co-liberation into our spaces, and start to really educate ourselves together as groups of people, because these concentric circles, they spread out, they fan out and connect to other concentric circles, creating these like networks of possibility and these islands of coherence in this time of collapse.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting, very well said. If people wants to read your work, do you have a newsletter or a book, some articles where people can
Yeah,
hear more about you?
I'll send you the links for a few articles, the book, Post Capitalist Philanthropy, Healing Wealth in Time of Collapse. The book is out. It's been out for about a year now. There's a focus on philanthropy, but philanthropy is really just the foil and in some ways just one externality of the system. So you could just read it in that way. And it has a lot of the kind of analysis on power and where do we go from here embedded in that, and kind of links the mystical and the political.
Amazing, amazing. I'm gonna come and see you then, and then I'm gonna report from Tierra Valiente if you invite me.
Please, anytime you have an open invite. Love to have you here.
Thank you so much, Alnoor, and congratulations for your work. Thank you. We're all very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you, brother.
Koka sunarai sunarayente. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayente.